Everybody, of course, is talking about and hearing about GLP-1. What a lot of people don't recognize is that GLP-1, the hormone, is actually made in the gut, and it's by way of these very critical organisms. My approach to health is, what are my symptoms? Now, what is my body missing? Sometimes it just means giving it back the tools that it needs in order to perform those functions. So you may not need a GLP-1 injection. You may just need these organisms to sort of restore that butyrate production and to get your gut back to making GLP-1 like it's supposed to.
Welcome to The Trusted Pharmacist, where you'll learn the truth about how the body works. Welcome back to the Trusted Pharmacist podcast, where we pull back the curtain on the healthcare system and explore the truth about how the body works. I'm your host, Steve Hofford, and today we're diving into one of the most cutting-edge frontiers in health, and that's your gut microbiome. Joining me today is Christina O'Connor, a clinical dietitian and the senior healthcare account manager at Pendulum Therapeutics, a loving mom, and Christina sits at the intersection of nutrition, microbiome science, and metabolic health. And she's especially passionate about one tiny but mighty microbiome that makes big waves in research, and that's called Akkermansia muciniphilia. In this episode, we're going to explore why Akkermansia is considered a keystone strain for the gut barrier integrity, metabolic health, and GLP-1 regulation. We're unpacking the science behind live versus pasteurized strains, how dietary polyphenols feed the microbiomes, and what you can do today to shift your gut in a healthier direction. Whether you're balancing or battling blood sugar issues, chronic inflammation, or just trying to improve your overall wellness, this conversation will give you practical, science-backed insights into how optimizing your gut can transform your health from the inside out. Christina, thanks for joining me.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here and have this conversation with you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I will tell you, gut microbiome is one of those things that just exploded. I'm lucky I've had a mentor that was pushing microbiome things for many years past. And so it's really exciting that, it's really jumped to the forefront, especially with things like Akkermansia now, as far as that goes. But for you, kind of what first drew you into working on this microbiome space and especially working with Pendulum?
Absolutely. So I'm a huge gut microbiome nerd. Obviously, you mentioned I'm a registered dietitian. So I started my early career working in the NICU, so with preterm babies. And if anybody knows anything about preterm babies, they have a lot of gut issues. Most of them are born with the gut not even working yet. And so there's a lot that goes into, the environment that you're born in, the way that you're born, because you're kind of set up with your microbiome from the very beginning of life. And so that really piqued my interest. And so even on the side, I started reading books about the gut microbiome and how it influences all areas of health. So after about 6 years of staying home with my own kiddos, I rejoined the workforce and landed this incredible opportunity at this really innovative company, Pendulum Therapeutics.
Very cool. So let's start at the beginning, because we got some that are deep in this and some that aren't. If you looked at your gut microbiome, other than just being a bunch of bacteria that may help with digestion, what do you see, or if you're explaining to somebody what a gut microbiome is, how would you explain it?
Yeah, so it really is an organ system in and of itself is what we're sort of considering it now. And there are trillions of organisms that live in us and also on us. So you have the skin microbiome, you have the urogenital microbiome, you have the gut microbiome. And these are organisms that actually we benefit them and they benefit us as a human host. So there's a symbiotic relationship that's going on between these organisms and the human host.
Very cool. So you mentioned gut microbiome, trillions of gut bacteria, but there's one in particular, and I'm going back to all my wellness training, and this goes back for probably 8 or 9 years now. There's one thing that got brought up in one of the lectures a long time ago, was like, if you can equate a healthy gut to having this keystone strain, and that's called the Akkermansia muciniphilia. And from here on out, I'll say Akkermansia because I don't want to say all that fancy stuff. But what makes Akkermansia like that golden child right now in overall gut health?
Absolutely. So there are about 7 strains that are considered keystone and critical for human health. So when you look at the literature, when we see these strains missing from the human gut microbiome, we see a negative downstream effects in human health. And Akkermansia maybe because it starts with an A, but is at the top of that list. And so it is considered one of those keystone commensal strains that is really critical for human health. And that's for a couple of different reasons. But one of the main reasons is because it helps with gut barrier integrity. So just to do a little anatomy lesson, your gut barrier is semi-permeable. So we need to allow water and nutrients and things like that to be able to pass through freely. But we also want to keep out, it needs to be a selective barrier. We need to keep out toxins. We need to keep out pathogenic and opportunistic bacteria. Because when those things are getting into systemic circulation, they're sparking inflammation. And we know that inflammation is really the root cause of all disease.
And that's a great point. I like that you're bringing that up. Is it all kind of goes back to that gut and inflammation, and that's kind of how Akkermansia plays in the gut to make sure that we can keep inflammation low, and that important aspect of what it does in the gut.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of dive into its mechanism of action, it has a really unique and almost strange role to play within the gut microbiome. So you mentioned its full name, Akkermansia muciniphila, and that just means that it's a mucin loving organism. So it lives in kind of this mucosal barrier between the gut and the rest of the body. And Akkermansia comes in and kind of acts like a cleanup crew. That layer of mucus, it needs to be turned over and refreshed every 5 to 7 days or so. And so Akkermansia comes in and it actually eats away at the old stuff, right? So like the dead stuff that needs to be sloughed off, it consumes it, and that stimulates us as the human host. It stimulates our very own goblet cells that, hey, it's time to produce that new fresh layer of mucus. So then you get a mucosal barrier that's refreshed, it's new, it's thick, it's not patchy, it's not worn out. And I almost think of it as like fly paper, where stuff comes to get stuck and it doesn't get into circulation.
No, and that's a great point. And I think one of the things we realize is any mucosal tissue in our body that goes through your nasal passages, your lungs, your mouth, the vaginal tissue, that mucosal layer is there, but there is that mucin layer that takes and protects that skin, because that skin is a barrier. It is that protective mechanism. And like, as you mentioned, it has to be cleaned up and it has to be there, because if that mucin falls apart, we talk a lot about leaky gut and all that, then that gut barrier integrity starts to go away and we start having some other sorts. So let's kind of take a little deeper dive into that. And if you look at also too, Akkermansia is really good about helping something called short chain fatty acids be produced. And there's those lining, like you said, that cheesecloth or that one layer thick of lining. Kind of talk about what Akkermansia does in terms of short chain fatty acids and help maintain that intestinal barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. So short chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate, is an incredible currency within the gut microbiome. It's the main fuel source for the colonic cells. It actually helps with mitochondria health. And it also helps with the functions of metabolism. So Akkermansia creates something called propionate, which is a precursor to butyrate. And I encourage your listeners, if they love this topic, to go explore all of the different benefits of short chain fatty acids, because I'm still learning. There are still things that are popping up that, oh yeah, short chain fatty acids help with that too. So we want as many of these butyrate producing organisms in the gut as possible.
No, and that's great. So we talked about gut barrier integrity, making sure the mucin layer's healthy, helping the body have more short chain fatty acid production. There's another flip side thing. And to me, this is what's gotten kind of popular with compounded GLP-1s have gone away and everybody's looking on metabolic health. Like, what's the next big thing? And I'll kind of get my thoughts on that too. But I want to get your thoughts. What's another thing that Akkermansia does to impact our metabolic health?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it actually all ties back to Akkermansia being a butyrate producer. And so I think, everybody, of course, is talking about and hearing about GLP-1. But I think what a lot of people don't recognize is that GLP-1, the hormone, is actually made in the gut. And it's by way of these very critical organisms. So it makes sense that a lot of people are not making their own GLP-1, especially if they're missing a lot of these organisms like Akkermansia and some of the other butyrate producers. So butyrate is really the key to unlocking the GLP-1 hormone. So butyrate actually binds to the receptor sites on our intestinal L cells. And that binding relationship is what flips on the GLP-1 hormone. So a lot of times sort of my approach to health is, okay, what are my symptoms? Now, what is my body missing? Because your body is trying to perform all of these functions in the way that it's accustomed to. And so sometimes it just means giving it back the tools that it needs in order to perform those functions. So you may not need a GLP-1 injection. You may just need these organisms to sort of restore that butyrate production and to get your gut back to making GLP-1 like it's supposed to.
Yeah, and that's an awesome call out. And I like how you put that. And people ask me all the time, oh, so I can take Akkermansia and it's going to work like a GLP-1 drug. I'm like, no, it's not quite like that. It's our own body's innate ability to produce GLP-1, which does everything the drug. I'm a pharmacist, and I'm like, I like to use the analogy, and I think I may even heard it on one of you guys' presentations was, if GLP-1 that we produce is like a 1, these drugs, which are synthetic analogs, they're like 100 times that. So, it's not the same, but anything you can do to help increase your own GLP-1 production is going to help all the benefits in terms of satiety, appetite control, and all of those type things. So we want to try to make that happen. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Perlman, our chief medical officer, he made that. He said, you really can't compare them. You really shouldn't compare them. But if you had to, that's exactly what he says. So yeah.
That's awesome. So you guys have done some research, and we'll take Akkermansia as one strain, but lots of times if we buddy up these strains and put them together, we see benefits. Y'all know y'all have recently done a study, a pendulum, where a certain formula that you have that has Akkermansia can actually lower somebody's hemoglobin A1C by like 0.6%. Which in terms of drugs, like that's a blockbuster $1 trillion drug, as far as that goes. And here we're talking gut bacteria. Tell me like how that combination of bacterias together in that one product, which is glucose control, tell me how that helps actually to control blood sugar control and the different areas in terms of like postprandial, that type of stuff in terms of blood sugar control.
Absolutely. And that study that you're referring to on our glucose control formulation is actually what got me so excited about Pendulum as a company. So I'm a dietitian first, right? I love the research. And so when there's a supplement on the market, I want to know if it's a waste of money or if they actually have clinical data to support that the supplements are working. And so, yes, like you mentioned, we were able to achieve similar results to a very popular type 2 diabetes medication, metformin, which a lot of people are familiar with. So when you combine Akkermansia and a couple of other strains, we lump them into the butyrate producing category. So it's Akkermansia, Clostridium butyricum, Clostridium bernicki, Anaerobutyricum hali, and Bifidobacterium infantis. So those are the 5 strains that are in our glucose control formulation. We studied this formula in patients with type 2. We told them, don't change a thing about your diet, your lifestyle. You're just going to be in one of these 3 arms. It was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. So for anybody that doesn't know, that's the gold standard for clinical research. And these type 2 diabetics some of them took the glucose control, and just after 90 days, they saw a 0.6 reduction in their A1C. And when you compare that to metformin's range for lowering A1C is like 0.7 to 1.2. So we were really proud of that. And then for the after meal glucose spikes, we were able to achieve almost 33% reduction in those spikes. And metformin's range for lowering those spikes is right around 20%. So we were able to outperform the drug in that way. And so we're really proud of that. And it just shows, like what we were talking about earlier, giving your body back the tools that it needs to perform these functions of metabolism. Maybe you don't actually need a drug. Maybe your body just needs some restoration, and then it can do these things on its own.
And one of the untold stories that you didn't say there, but you can't, but I'll say it as a pharmacist, is you control those blood sugar spikes after meals. But I'm going to say with that blood sugar spike control comes insulin spike control, which to me is really the driver of what most metabolic problems is, and that's insulin resistance. And if you can keep those blood sugars in a nice tight window, you're not going to have the insulin spikes, which drives insulin resistance and all the horrible things that go along with it. And that's what makes that product really powerful in terms of an add-on to other things you can do that's safe, that can really be done. And that's the part to me that's super excited about it.
Yeah.
So when it comes to probiotics, one of the things I always like to ask is, okay, so we can take this probiotic and it gets in the system, but especially like Akkermansia, I know there's certain things specifically that we know help Akkermansia hang out and be there and not go away. Because like sometimes I get the question all the time, and I'd love to get your take. How long should I take an Akkermansia product? Should I take it forever? Because I'm not going to lie, I'm a big rotate probiotic strain person. That's how I've always been trained. What's your take on that? What are things people can do to make sure that Akkermansia lives there as long as possible? But then also too, do you recommending any kind of rotation? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I do. That's always been my take as well, that it's important to cycle and rotate and switch up your probiotics. Akkermansia is a strain that I come back to quite often because of the amount of insults that we see on the gut barrier these days. So it's not enough to just eat healthy, right? You also have to avoid the toxins that are in our foods, which it's becoming more and more difficult to do that. And so that's a huge disruptor of the gut barrier. Additionally, we think of the obvious, like antibiotics are destroying the gut microbiome, but even just a course of pharmaceuticals has implications when it comes to disrupting the gut microbiome. When women go through perimenopause and menopause, that changes the gut microbiome. Things like travel, diet, there are just so many things that are influencing the gut and the organisms living there that these are strains that I continually come back to. As far as keeping Akkermansia, the best thing that you can do is to nourish and help your own Akkermansia. So if you have Akkermansia, and you can find out by doing a stool test. But if you have your own Akkermansia, it's really important to make sure that you're eating a diet high in polyphenols, because the research is very clear that Akkermansia's energy source is polyphenols. And so our strain here at Pendulum, there are many different types of Akkermansia strains, but our strain in particular, we looked at an in vitro study to see, does it like all polyphenols? Is it choosy? And it happened to be green tea extract, red grape seed, and pomegranate. So of course we have those three in a booster product to boost our strain. But those are the three, just to give an example to the audience of what our particular Akkermansia strain likes. And then to answer your question about whether or not the organism, people will ask, how long do I have to take this? Will the organism colonize and kind of set up camp and become a permanent resident of the gut microbiome? And we've gotten some mixed information on that front. So the study that I mentioned earlier on the glucose control formulation, after the washout period, so that means that the patients weren't taking the products any longer for about a period of 4 weeks. And we saw 80% of them didn't hang on to anything. They didn't hang on to the Akkermansia or the butyrate producers, but about 20% of them did hang on to something. And so we didn't know why that was, because of course we didn't tell them to change their diet or to make any dietary modifications. So our hypothesis walking away from that was, well, maybe that 20% was eating a diet rich in fiber and polyphenols. And that's why they were able to hang on to the strains. We have some new research coming out, some stool testing that we did with our high doses of Akkermansia. And that led to some promising information as well about the opportunity for the strains, because the Akkermansia is live, that it may have more of a chance to kind of hang on. So we recommend a minimum of 3 months with any of our products. But a lot of people tend to stay on them longer, especially if they're looking to lower A1C and after meal glucose spikes. They see that they're getting those benefits, and so they decide to stay on it for longer.
So let's talk about Akkermansia. And like you said, it's a bacteria, it's a beneficial bacteria, but we need to feed it. What if we don't give it polyphenols? What if we don't give it the fiber it needs? Is it definitely probably not hang out as much, but is there any detrimental effects if you don't give Akkermansia what it needs to be successful?
If you have your own Akkermansia, you were lucky enough that your mom had Akkermansia and she passed it to you through the birthing process. And interestingly enough, the only food that Akkermansia has ever been isolated in is breast milk. So if you're fortunate enough to get that gift, we know that it is critical to consume polyphenols in order to hang on to it. And if it doesn't get what it needs, it is a pretty sensitive bug. And that's kind of what we think is the reason why it goes missing in so many people, is because it's not being fed properly.
So that's interesting. So we're saying, and I had never heard that before. So you're saying if you weren't breastfed, there's a probably good likelihood you may not have much Akkermansia, because it's just something we're going to have a hard time getting through our food supply and things like that, correct?
That's exactly right. And it's a combination of things that happen at birth. So going through the vaginal canal, so having a vaginal birth, and then also being breastfed. So those are two things that are hopefully mom has the Akkermansia. Those are two things that are going to set you up. But what's unique about Akkermansia, and the reason that it hasn't been available in supplement form until very recently, is because this organism is an anaerobe. So that means that a single molecule of oxygen destroys it. It lives in our colon, which is an oxygen-free environment. And so you're not going to find it in your fermented foods, in your yogurts. You're not going to get it from your environment, playing in the dirt. And that's typically, the strains that are found in the marketplace today. They're oxygen friendly. And so those are the strains that are easy to grow. They are found in your foods and in your environment. We interact with them daily. They're great. They're super helpful for human health. But this is really kind of the next frontier of some of these novel strains. This technology to grow anaerobic bacteria has finally been unlocked. And so I see a future where, we have very specific antibiotics for, whatever ails you. And so I think that we're now going to assign probiotics based on, what they can do for us as the human host, depending on what it is that you're dealing with.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I do think the day is coming where there will be specific probiotic blends that are specific for GI, brain. We talk about that. I talk about certain strains all the time, like Lactobacillus rhamnosus, which helps the body make dopamines and serotonins, and Reuteri helps the body makes oxytocin. You're right. There are therapeutic benefits to certain strains that we know. And I think Akkermansia is one of those that has that benefit. So you brought up a great point, because that is one of the things that makes Pendulum's product unique. And was like my first foray in recommending an Akkermansia product. There's a lot of products popping up, and I see advertisements on the web and everything now about Akkermansia. From what I'm aware, nobody has the technology you have. So if you get an Akkermansia product that's not from Pendulum, and once again, this isn't a sales for Pendulum, but I do sell Pendulum's product, that it's one of those things with the way you process it, you allow it to have the integrity to get from the stomach to the small intestine to the colon to where it can benefit, versus the other product are dead bacteria, Akkermansia. And granted, there may be some benefit. Tell me what you guys know in terms of live versus like the not live version in terms of the health benefit.
Absolutely. So the other products that are popping up, and for the longest time, Pendulum was the only product in the marketplace that had Akkermansia. We literally had no competition. But of course, the word got out that Akkermansia is good, and so everybody wants to capitalize on this moment. But yeah, so the products that are popping up are what's called pasteurized Akkermansia. And by definition, in order to be a probiotic, the organism actually needs to be alive. And so these are actually not probiotics; they're more postbiotics when the organism is pasteurized, which, as you mentioned, does have some benefit for us as the human host. It doesn't have nearly the benefits that the live organism does, but it does offer some benefit. So the manufacturers are not taking any effort to keep the organism alive. They're just doing the standard manufacturing process for probiotics and producing the pasteurized or the dead organism. So Pendulum, like you mentioned, we developed the technology to be able to grow anaerobic strains, and then they're freeze dried. And so that puts them into sort of a sleeping and dormant state. Then they're encapsulated in an acid resistant capsule. So we need it to survive digestion. And then it's also a time released capsule. So we need it to survive the journey through the small intestine and end up in the colon where it's going to be doing its function. And so when you think about the way that nature intended for the organisms to exist within us, they're supposed to be alive. You don't get the dead organism is not in there consuming the old worn out mucin in the mucosal barrier. And so the body's not getting that same stimulation or feedback that it's time to produce that new fresh layer of mucus. There's also a protein called P9, which has direct implications in metabolism. And the pasteurized organism makes absolutely zero P9, whereas the live Akkermansia makes a good amount.
Yeah, and that's great. And I appreciate you explaining that. And that's a good deep dive. I mean, we all know with probiotics and all the strains, the body, due to digestion, breaks them up. And a lot of the bacteria, most of the good probiotics, they may not get to the colon in their full live effect. Now, there are bits and pieces on those DNA that have messengers, it can turn on pathways and stuff. You're right. But I do want people to understand there is a difference in Akkermansia products specifically because it is an anaerobe. I think that's a great point that you called out there. One of the things you mentioned, we've kind of talked a little bit about its effect on GLP-1. Can somebody take an Akkermansia product, even if they're on, let's say, like a GLP-1, like a semaglutide and tirzepatide? Is it okay if they took those two together?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of our healthcare professionals doing exactly that. And what they find is when you add the GLP-1 strains like Akkermansia and Clostridium butyricum, when you add those, you're making some meaningful changes to the gut in the background. You're also helping with some of those GI symptoms that come along with using the injections. And we found that these strains they help a lot with food cravings. And so when people are taking the injections, this has been a nice way to kind of create an exit ramp for titrating off of the injections. But then it also is just a nice companion product to come alongside and help with some of those GI side effects. And like I mentioned, it's getting the body able to make its own GLP-1 hormone. And some providers have even reported that patients don't end up needing as much of the injection when they use the probiotics because, again, like I said, the gut is making its own GLP-1.
You mentioned earlier about how, and this is a large part of our audience, is this perimenopausal, menopausal female who have hormone changes, and that has a dramatic effect on the gut. And I think, and one of the big things we get is weight gain, and I can't lose weight anymore, and all those aspects and all. Kind of give your take on why maybe Akkermansia, maybe that probiotic that's for that postmenopausal or perimenopausal female and some of the benefits there. I know you've kind of talked about some of it, but just kind of give me why for that particular population.
Yeah, absolutely. So it has been shown that when women go through perimenopause and menopause, that Akkermansia levels take a dip. But we also see, the group of folks that have longevity on their side, called centenarians, right? They're living to be over 100 years old, and they're active, right? They're hiking, they're swimming, they're living their best lives. They have high levels of Akkermansia. So we know that it's something that we want to try to hang on to from a longevity standpoint. And then we also see it taking a dip, or it's being harmed during perimenopause and menopause. So it is a huge component for the women's health story as far as helping with inflammation. The gut is really a key player in helping to balance and regulate hormones. And so we've seen a lot of success with women's health, and then also in conditions like PCOS, because you think about the hormonal shifts that are happening there. We see Akkermansia being a key player in those conditions as well.
Very cool. So is there, obviously we've made it look like the golden child, which it really is, but is there anybody who's not a good candidate for Akkermansia, or is there any situations or conditions that you look as maybe like a contraindication or probably shouldn't take Akkermansia?
Yeah, your septic ICU patient is definitely someone that should not take probiotics in general. I mentioned that just because there was a paper that came out recently. But for the most part, probiotics are generally considered safe. I will mention that we do not have safety or tolerability studies in pediatrics. We don't have it in pregnancy or lactation. So definitely something that we hope to be able to expand on in the future. But again, for the most part, probiotics are generally considered safe. And so we haven't come up against any specific disease conditions or states where we feel like, people shouldn't take Akkermansia.
So I'll throw one out that we do kind of run into a challenge with people with probiotic challenges. Those people with like SIBO and SIFO, those are people who have a disordinate or dysbiosis, an inordinate of either bad bacteria or an inordinate amount of not good bacteria. How do you feel, from what you've heard through clinical stuff, how do you feel like your patients tolerate your products or the Akkermansia that have SIBO and SIFO?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have seen where Akkermansia and some of these other butyrate producing bugs are really good at rebalancing the gut and kind of getting these opportunistic bacteria in check. And so it does depend on the starting gut microbiome in terms of how someone is going to tolerate the products and the strains. For patients that are dealing with those conditions specifically, we've found that a low and slow approach, so, rather than taking the probiotic every day, taking it every other day, and sort of testing tolerance that way. But then also we have a very specific formulation called Metabolic Daily that contains Akkermansia, contains all of the same butyrate producing bugs, but it's actually the formula that is inulin free. So it doesn't have any of that prebiotic chicory root fiber, which we know can be problematic for our SIBO patients. So that is definitely the most gentle formulation, and is the one that we highly recommend for anybody who has food intolerances or is already dealing with dysbiosis.
Yeah, and that's a great call out. And I'm like you said, and that product I think has lower doses of the product. And I think that's kind of always my take, start low. But that's what I learned about Akkermansia 8 years ago was Akkermansia equals diversity, and diversity equals gut health. And that's really what it comes down to. So that's pretty awesome there. So if you were looking, this is kind of an off the wall because this is what you do for a living. If there was one myth about gut health you wish everyone would stop believing, what would that be?
Oh gosh. A myth about gut health. Well, I think in general, I wish that more people just understood the connection. If you go all the way back to Hippocrates saying that, it all starts in the gut, and we somehow ignored that advice or just, didn't pay attention to it. And so we're just now realizing that the gut influences all aspects of health. So, the gut-brain connection is one of my absolute favorites to talk about. And, there's the gut-skin gut metabolism. I mean, it literally is called, the gut is called the second brain for a reason. It really impacts every area of health. So when you have good gut health, you tend to be healthier and have less symptoms.
Yeah, and I love that. And it's funny you say that because as a pharmacist, one of the things, we're very accessible. You don't have to have an appointment. People walk in all the time. Is like, hey, one of the most common things we get is skin stuff. They have rashes and all these different things and hives. And it's so funny. Like people come up with that stuff. I think they're looking for me to give them like things for topicals. But the first thing I'm like, nope, let's go work on your gut. And I can tell you what's going to happen is it's going to clear up on its own and we don't have to use stuff. So it's so funny that you brought that up. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. There's lots of research that talks about, specifically eczema, psoriasis, and acne as being an intestinal barrier issue. And so we have a whole group of what they call themselves integrative dermatologists that, like you mentioned, they work on the gut to clear the skin. And their before and after pictures are absolutely jaw-dropping.
No, that's pretty cool. So if you were taking a patient today and they're like, I really never thought about gut health today, but it's time to like jump in and start looking. What are some things you think that support gut health naturally, whether or not they really even use a supplement? What's your thoughts and take there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as a dietitian, I'm always looking, for dietary sources of fiber and polyphenols. That's really going to help support beneficial microbial diversity within the gut microbiome. And at Pendulum, we're a whole team of dietitians on the healthcare side of the business. So we have lots of resources for patients and healthcare providers in terms of, what does a healthy diet look like that will support those healthy, good strains of bacteria. And it really comes down to fiber and polyphenols.
Very good. And I like that. So if kind of looking at this stuff, if you were to go back and look at your childhood, doing all this functional stuff that you've been doing now, and you could change one thing today that you think would have the biggest impact on your health today, what's the thing for your childhood you think you would change and do differently now that you know all you know?
Oh, man. I wasn't breastfed. And not to shame my mom, it was the 80s. Everybody was formula feeding. But it's definitely something that I realized as a mom would set my kiddos up for optimal health. But, even when you do everything right, my oldest still has asthma and allergies and eczema. So, genetics plays a role as well. But I can't emphasize enough. And of course, that's my area of expertise is maternal and infant nutrition. And so giving kiddos and mom being healthy and giving baby a good start in life is, because the gut microbiome is formed from birth to about the age of 3. So it's a pretty small window that you have to influence through dietary choices. And then also through, how you're born.
Very cool. Taking a probiotic, for instance, is like one piece of the puzzle. You kind of mentioned it's if you don't just, if all you're going to do is take a probiotic, but you're not going to change your diet, work on stress and better sleep and all that, you're kind of just wasting your time. But it is one piece of that puzzle that can be huge. What about like athletes trying to get an edge? I mean, they do all the right things. But the one thing they may not think is, can a probiotic make a difference in their athletic performance? Tell me a little about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, we've actually done some research in the athlete space. And so we had these athletes take our strains and then we asked them a series of questions over a period of time. Has your sleep improved? Has your endurance improved? And they all had significant improvement in those things: performance, sleep, endurance. And so when we talk about short chain fatty acids and butyrate and how it affects the mitochondria, that's a big part of the story when it comes to athletes. And then also managing blood sugar spikes, because, you really don't want that happening when you're trying to perform at your best. And then also, can you imagine being an athlete, an elite athlete, and having to perform at your best, but you can't go to the bathroom, or you have GI issues and your stomach just hurts, right? that is not an optimal condition for performance. So yes, and this isn't something that Pendulum really was going after. The information and the athletes came to us, and we've had really great success in that space.
And that's powerful. And I appreciate you sharing that, because I see that with a lot of high-end athletes or athletes that really push themselves. That gut barrier integrity is such an issue. And if there's anything, i.e. Akkermansia, that can help maintain a good, healthy gut lining, that's so important. So that's really awesome. This has been great stuff. And I know our audience will really enjoy it. If I've got listeners today that want to learn more about your research or about Pendulum or your probiotic work, where can they go to find that information?
Yeah, well, they can certainly come to you. Because you're well versed in the probiotic space and in Pendulum. But then our website is a great place. So pendulumlife.com. And we have space for patients, and then we have space for healthcare providers as well. All of that information is accessible to everyone. You can read about our publications. You can read about the research that is upcoming, which I think is really interesting. Like I mentioned, the gut brain, that's something that we're focusing on. And so, yeah, our website has a lot of great information.
Awesome. Christina, thank you so much for giving me your time today. Truly appreciate you. Shared a lot of wealthy information that can help benefit people with their gut health and what Akkermansia can do. Thank you so very much.
It's my favorite topic. Thanks so much for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.